Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the GSD Show. I'm your host, Mike Arce, and today I'm here with Glenn Gaesser. Glenn, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
We've been wanting to have you on for a little while, and COVID, of course, kind of put things, like did for many things, put things on the back burner, but we're finally here. And I'm very excited to have you on board because I think one of the things that a lot of businesses, not just fitness and health and wellness and all that, but I think even restaurants, dentistry, a lot of business owners I get to talk with, they know the outside, but they don't know the inside as well. And it hurts their ability to really advertise it and sell it well. They don't really understand it to the core in which guys like you understand it. And I see some of the most successful businesses, Orange Theory's done a good job of using data or using science to sell what they do. Now, you may argue against that data as far as the validity of it all, but regardless, that's what they've done. And some of the best advertisers of all time have used data and have used science and research in order to make their products or what they do stand out from the rest. I went to you because you're a researcher, essentially, right?
Yes.
And so talk to me about your background. What do you do right now? What have you done so that people know why I'm here with you?
Okay, so it's probably best to start from the beginning.
Okay.
I'm an exercise physiologist and got my PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, in exercise physiology in 1978. So I've been in academia ever since. I'm currently at ASU. Before that, I was at the University of Virginia. Before that, at UCLA. So I've always had an academic appointment. So my job has pretty much consisted of teaching and research. And my research primarily focuses on the acute and chronic responses and adaptations of the body to exercise and diet.
Okay.
So I've conducted probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 exercise training studies, lasting anywhere from a few weeks to months. Different populations, young, old, in between. Healthy, unhealthy, to look at how the body responds to exercise, and more specifically, what kind of physiological, cardiovascular, metabolic adaptations take place.
So really taking a look at the different types of exercise and people that might engage in those exercises and how does it actually affect the body? Not what should it do, but what does it actually do?
Okay, so it probably would be good to just make this statement right from the start. When a person exercises, there's probably not a single cell in the body that's not affected. So traditionally, we've kind of thought about exercise in terms of, well, it gets the heart rate up. So your cardiovascular system obviously is stressed. Your lungs, you're breathing more. We kind of think about it in those terms. But exercise also affects other tissues as well. So people who exercise well and a lot, we can get into more about what kinds might be better in some situations. Those individuals not only have fitter hearts, lungs, skeletal muscle, but also their other tissues. Their livers are healthier. Their kidneys are healthier. Their brain is healthier. And that's because exercise has an effect upon those tissues and those organs. Actually, and this may be a surprise to a lot of people, exercise actually makes your fat fitter.
What does that even mean?
So we think of it this way. Most people think of body fat as something we want to get rid of, right? And we've been struggling with that for decades and not doing a very good job of it because obesity prevalence continues to increase in the United States. But our effort has been to get rid of it. And that's all well and good. I mean, if people want to lose weight for purposes of losing weight, I mean, I'm not going to try to dissuade them from that, but I might inform them that the struggle is going to be very real and most people don't do that well at it. But what exercise does, besides just burning away calories, exercise fundamentally changes tissues throughout the body. So what I mean by this is that your adipose tissue, most adipose tissue in the body is subcutaneous, right underneath the skin. That tissue can change biochemically. so much so that it becomes actually healthier. So even if you don't get rid of body fat when you exercise, your body fat becomes healthier.
So now talk to me the difference of impact of unhealthy body fat versus body fat. If let's say Mike A has healthy body fat, and Mike B has unhealthy body fat, what's the difference in me, in my life, in the way I feel, the way I perform?
Yeah. Okay. So that needs a little bit more qualification. For example, we don't just have body fat per se. Body fat is all over. So most of the body fat is subcutaneous, right underneath the skin. That's the vast majority of all the body fat people typically store. We also have body fat in other places. So a lot of individuals store body fat in their gut. Not just the
outer layer.
Not the outer layer that you can just grab that belly, to get and pinch that. That's the subcutaneous fat. But between the skin and then subcutaneous, we have the subcutaneous fat and then the muscle. If you go into the abdominal cavity itself, we have what is referred to as visceral abdominal fat. That's unhealthy fat. And then we even have fat that is referred to as ectopic. Ectopic fat is fat in places where it shouldn't be. Fat around the heart, fat in the liver, fat inside skeletal muscle. So we have that ectopic fat. That's the unhealthiest of all. And that can be affected quite a bit by exercise. Same with the visceral fat.
Why is that unhealthy? Is it because it's too close to vital organs?
Yes.
Or?
Biochemically, what the unhealthy fat does is kind of like adipose tissue revved up. And a lot of the unhealthy fats that we have circulating in our bloodstream, let's say the free fatty acids, a lot of those come from these ectopic or visceral fat regions. So it's those body fat stores that are the most unhealthy. So you can have two individuals, you can get them on the scale, they can weigh exactly the same amount, give them a body fat test, a bod pod, underwater weighing, or any kind of body fat test you wanted to do, and they might come out with the same total body fat, but they might not have the same amounts of visceral or ectopic fat. So if you were to take two mics, all right, and you had a twin, it weighed the same, body fat was the same, but the one mic had a lot of visceral abdominal fat or ectopic fat. Even though their body, the muscle mass, everything else was the same, that individual would have a much greater likelihood of having cardiometabolic abnormalities, high blood pressure, dyslipidemias, glucose intolerance, inflammation, and so forth.
What about metabolism issues, stuff like that?
The metabolism in terms of just the metabolic rate, probably not much of a difference at all.
What about risk? Well, if there's inflammation, risk for cancers, stuff
for
like that?
risk, yes, absolutely. So for example, cancer. It's well known that people who exercise a lot have lower risk for cancer. A number of reasons for that. So for example, take just a cancer in general. One of the risks associated with cancer is having a chronically elevated insulin level. It's also a risk for diabetes. That's why individuals with diabetes are at higher risk for cancer.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so it's primarily due to the elevated insulin, which is a growth hormone. And some of the downstream metabolites like insulin, like growth factor, these are elevated in individuals who are obese, poor diet, lack of physical activity. So great study I can mention. It was done years ago by a former colleague of mine at UCLA. He got blood samples from older men who had been participating in an adult fitness center for on average about 10 or 15 years, and took blood samples. And then he got these little cell cultures of cancer cells that were basically kept alive in petri dishes. When you added the serum from the exercise-trained men who had been exercising for years, it tended to kill the cancer cells.
Really?
Yeah, and slow down the growth rate of those cancer cells. Now, if you added serum from just sedentary couch potatoes, no effect whatsoever. So there's something about the blood from these chronically exercised individuals that did something. Now, that's one of the potential mechanisms that could possibly explain why individuals who exercise a lot have lower risk of overall cancer rates. But the most common ones for which exercise has been linked to is lower risk of breast cancer in women, lower risk of colon cancer or colorectal cancer, and lower risk of prostate cancer.
That's interesting.
Yeah. But overall cancer rates are typically lower in individuals, and there's a biological mechanism for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, as a researcher, I'm sure a lot of questions drive you nuts because there's so many variables, and you probably get hit with a lot of broad questions. So this is going to be a broad question, and I'm sure there's variables to it. So it's one of those things where just do your best to deal with a guy like me. So you say people that exercise a lot, typically they would fall into a lower risk of cancer and other diseases, similar
diabetes,
to that.
heart disease, yes,
right.
Absolutely.
What's that line? Forget the aesthetics that everyone else is chasing.
Right.
What's the line of a lot where I know that if I can meet this quota of exercise, I should be in a healthy range where I know that I'm limiting my risk.
Right. Yeah. When I was talking about a lot with regard to those men in the cancer study, they were basically lifelong exercisers, and so they were. I mentioned a lot to describe that. But if you wanted to really quantify what is necessary, there is a dose response. So what this means is that there is a continuum of exercise dose that seems to provide better effects. Think of it in terms of medicine. So for example, if you want to lower your blood pressure or you want to lower your cholesterol, take cholesterol, for example, people take statins. If you want to lower your cholesterol, you might be prescribed a statin. Well, a little bit will lower it a little bit more will lower it more, and so forth. And then ultimately you'll get to a point where it won't lower it anymore because you reach kind of a lower limit below which you won't get that cholesterol any lower. Exercise kind of works that same way. So if you take a total couch potato and have them start doing something, they will see a benefit if you have them do more. Now, where is the optimum amount? Current public health recommendations suggest that individuals should be getting in at least 150 minutes a week of at least moderate intensity exercise.
Does it matter if it's sporadic or if it's one straight day?
It can be. The one straight day is kind of an extreme because the 150 minutes a week, that's like 2.5 hours in one day.
Yeah.
Very few people do that. Although there are actually several
studies. If you do like a hike every Sunday and it just takes you 3 hours.
Good point. There have been a few studies that have been published on this that have looked at individuals who spread it out over the week or do it all on perhaps like that weekend. They call them the weekend warriors.
Yeah.
And this is, the term came from individuals basically who don't have time during the week, but they get together with their friends and they play loads of basketball, soccer, whatever, for hours on the weekend. So they call them the weekend warriors, these competitive types of sports. But research suggests that individuals who do these kinds of activities, like your hikes and so forth, that may fall on just 1 or 2 days of the weekend, they seem to be just as well off as individuals who kind of spread it out over the course of the week. So the goal then should be try to get in at least 150 minutes a week that can be not only spread out throughout the week, but even throughout the day.
Okay.
So if someone doesn't have time for a 30, 40-minute cardio workout, they might have times for shorter bouts of activity.
Like a 10-minute brisk walk
or
around
something
the block.
like that. And when I mentioned moderate intensity activity is, the brisk walk is probably the best example of this. It's something where you're walking purposefully and but not really huffing and puffing.
Yeah, you're not killing yourself. It's
but not just meandering along, watching the flowers or mall walking or something like that. So if you ask most people if they hopped on a treadmill, we've done this in our lab, you basically say, get on a treadmill, turn the speed on, set it to a speed that you feel comfortable walking.
Is there a heart rate number, like 70% max heart rate, 65% max heart rate?
Well, the moderate intensity domain typically ranges somewhere between 50 and 60% of max heart rate, up to about 70 or so, 75% of max heart rate. That would be the moderate intensity domain. Most people can get into that quite easily.
Yeah, 70% is pretty easy. You can maintain that for a while.
For a long time,
Yeah.
yes.
So now the easiest way to measure it, I mean, there's probably more scientific reason, but is it 220 minus your age and then multiply that by the percentage?
Yes, there is an estimate. If you don't know your max heart rate,
Yeah.
you can take the 220 minus the age. That'll give you a good ballpark figure. But that's only a ballpark because there's a tremendous amount of individual variability in max heart rate. Good example, when I was 30 years ago, I was doing some research on older individuals. The average age was 70, and they ranged from, let's say, about low 60s up to about 80 years old. So if the average age is 70, you do the 220 minus your age, their max heart rate should have been like right around 150.
Yeah.
So we did max tests on a treadmill, and we had max heart rates that ranged from about 129 to 185. So the average was about 150, but we had some that were like 20 some odd beats below that and some that were 25, 30 beats above that. And so if you have someone who uses the 220 minus the age and they really have a much lower heart rate than that, they might be kind of overstressed because they might think, well, I should be exercising at this heart rate, and I really feel that that's a struggle.
How do you find it out if you don't want to use that formula? Is there another way or an easier way to find out what your max heart rate could or should be?
Well, the easiest way for people who are healthy and don't really think they have anything to worry about in terms of their health, in other words, no chest pains, they're not at high risk, they can do somewhat of what I would call a self-conducted stress test.
Okay.
In other words, if you had a treadmill or a cycle ergometer, or even if you didn't, you could walk around or jog around a track or something like that. It's easier to do on a treadmill because you can control the speed and grade, and then the bike the same way. You can actually just kind of ramp it up. Get on a treadmill, set it at 0 grade and 2-3 miles per hour, and then every minute or so up the speed a little or up the grade until the point where you feel like, wow, this is it. I'm pretty much at my limit or near my limit. Might be able to go a little bit longer, but no need to. Stop it, hop off the treadmill, palpate, and you can get a pretty good idea. That would be a rough estimate. But I wouldn't recommend doing that unless a person thought they were fairly healthy. In other words, if someone hasn't exercised in a long time, and they might have some risk factors, they probably should see a physician. Annual checkup would be a great time to do this and say, hey, I've been sedentary for a long time. I want to take up an exercise program. Am I okay to do this? So,
is it possible to increase someone's max heart rate?
Not really. No, that's pretty much an individual thing that I don't know of any really good evidence to suggest that is the case. It declines with age, and there's pretty much nothing you can do about it.
Okay. But
for the most part, if individuals want to do something for their health and get in 150 minutes, let's say, of moderate intensity, and again, I mentioned the dose response, you will get a better benefit if you go to 200 or 250 or even 300. So there's definitely a dose. The 150 is basically the kind of the lower threshold that people should try to reach for. But even if they don't get there, you'll get benefit even if you do half of that. Yeah. So the thing is, with moderate intensity activity, there's really no need to do a stress test or know your maximum heart rate, because moderate intensity activity is it's like the brisk walking I mentioned. It's an activity where you can exercise, you might notice your breathing, but you're not out of breath.
Okay. So talk to me about HIIT training, which is probably the most popular right now. It's really exploding. Orange Theory does it. F45 does it. A lot of boot camps are doing it. Yeah. And it's just high intensity interval training. And, Orange Theory is actually using heart rate. Yeah. And I believe F45 as well, where they're seeing, okay, here's where you want. Orange Theory actually has 4 different tiles, and they want to get you up and down, up and down. You've studied HIIT training quite a bit, correct? What kind of studies have you done? Like, how extensive has it been on HIIT training?
Okay, so we have done a number of studies. The first I ever did was in 1985. I was an assistant professor at UCLA, and I had a.
It wasn't even called that back then, right?
It was not called that. It was just called interval training. Okay. That was it. When I was in high school and college in the 60s and early 70s, we did what was known as interval training. And it's nothing more than what is now referred to as HIIT, the high-intensity interval training. So there are a lot of ways you can do this because there's virtually an infinite number of ways you can construct a HIIT workout because you have the number of repetitions, you have the rest interval, you have the duration of the intervals, you have the intensity. So you can construct them however suits your needs. The classic kind of interval training was typically what would be referred to as aerobic interval training. So the intervals typically lasted anywhere from about 1 to 4 minutes, typically with about 1 to 3 minutes of recovery in between. And the high intensity range typically got an individual up to about 85 to 95% of their maximum heart rate.
Okay.
All right.
For about how long?
Typically 1 to 4 minutes. That would be the range.
4 minutes is a long time to maintain 90%.
Actually, it's not.
Pretty doable.
Yes, and the reason for that is because if you're monitoring heart rate, then the power output or the running speed, whatever you're measuring, might have to be reduced. So, for example, we published a study a few years ago where we had people in the laboratory with heart rate monitors on, and we kept their heart rate exactly between 90 and 95%. So we knew within a few beats exactly what we needed to shoot for in a workout. And so we were monitoring that real time while they're doing their exercise. And we noticed that when they were doing 4-minute long intervals or even 1-minute long intervals, as the workout progressed, we had to lower their actual power output. We did this on a cycloergometer, the power output they were maintaining, because if we didn't, their heart rate would continue to get up to maximum. So it's not that difficult to maintain 90% of max heart rate for a fairly sustained period of time.
This is most likely a myth, which is why I'm asking you. I've heard that if you work out and you're doing, let's say, whether it's interval training or cardiovascular, maybe there's differences between these two, and you get your heart rate to above that 90%, you're burning energy faster than fat can burn, and so you start possibly burning into muscle. Is that even a thing?
No, it's not a thing.
So can you burn muscle for energy like that, and how does that work?
All right. The two major fuels for exercise are fat and carbohydrate. All right. That's it.
So you can't use muscle for fuel?
You can use muscle as a fuel.
How does can you do it through exercise but through hard work?
Yeah, but here's the deal. We store fat and protein, or fat and carbohydrate in the body. Fat, the tissues I mentioned before, subcutaneous, visceral fat, and so forth. The two major tissues that we store carbohydrate is muscle, that's the major one, as glycogen, and liver, and that's it. The liver glycogen goes up and down almost from max levels to nothing over the course of the day. So we use that to maintain blood sugar levels. Skeletal muscle is not so much because we have a lot of the glycogen in there, and that takes a lot to burn it down. It might be a long workout, a huge HIIT workout, or a long steady state endurance effort to do that.
So in a 45-minute workout, you're not tapping into muscle.
You will muscle glycogen.
Muscle glycogen, but not the actual muscle fibers.
No, the only time skeletal muscle or protein in general, because we don't store it, so store protein. So the only way you can use protein from muscle, and that's the major place where we have muscle, protein in the body is in muscle. The only way you can use that as a fuel is you have to degrade that protein into amino acids and convert those amino acids into fuels that can be burned like carbohydrate and fat. So there are a lot of amino acids that can be broken down, and the nitrogen group on them can be eliminated through transamination or deamination. The carbon skeleton that's left behind can be converted to a carbohydrate, or it can be converted to a fatty acid. So those fuels can then be burned. There are only really two situations where you have significant protein use as a fuel, and that would be under conditions of starvation or conditions of prolonged exercise under extreme low glycogen levels. So
as long as you have glycogen in there.
As long as you have glycogen, and you'll always have fat. As long as you have glycogen, your use of protein as a fuel will be very minimal.
So if you're doing a high protein, high fat diet, very, very low or no carb diet, which a lot of people are jumping into, which is crazy if you're doing high exercise like that. Now, because you have you're not feeding your body enough carbohydrates, in glycogen, now you have the opportunity to start burning muscle through your exercise, or even then it's hard?
Even then it's hard. And the reason
Really?
for that is because individuals will largely use fat, all right, as a fuel. So again, the protein anywhere in the body, especially in skeletal muscle, is rarely going to be used as a fuel, unless, again, as I mentioned, you're virtually starving, so you have no fuel coming in, and the reason for that is because what happens is that, under starvation conditions, your glycogen levels, particularly in the liver and then later on in skeletal muscle, will fall to very low levels. You rely heavily upon fat, but you'll also rely on protein. But what you need the protein for under those conditions is largely to maintain blood sugar levels.
Okay.
So you'll be degrading the protein, but a lot of those proteins that are degraded will be converted to amino acids that can be converted to blood sugar levels.
Okay.
So if you look at blood sugar levels for individuals who have been on prolonged fast, they're only down a little bit, even though they have no liver glycogen, which is the major source of the blood sugar outside of the foods we eat. So if you're not eating anything and your liver glycogen's low, you have a problem. All right, you need to have some other source of fuel to maintain blood sugar levels, and that becomes our protein. So that's it's called gluconeogenesis. We make glucose out of precursor substances.
Wow.
So that normally doesn't happen. So people should not be thinking about using muscle as a fuel virtually at any time.
It's not a goal. I think it's more of a fear. A lot of people are afraid of, they work too hard, they're going to burn muscle.
No, it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
No, it would be extraordinarily rare to do that.
A lot of bodybuilders will talk about, because obviously they can see a difference in their body very easily, low fat, and they're studying it. When they have a lot of carbs, they feel like their muscles are pumped up a lot more. When they have low carbs, they feel like their muscles have gone down a little bit.
Sure.
And that's because of the glycogen that's being stored in the muscle.
Yeah, so glycogen, when it's stored in tissues like liver and muscle, for every gram of glycogen, you store dry weight glycogen, the carbohydrate. You'll store about 2.5 to 3 grams of water with it.
Wow.
Okay, so when you store the glycogen in muscle, you'll kind of soak up some water from the surrounding tissues and store it in there. So that might be that feeling.
Yeah.
So, for example, the average person might have anywhere from, depends on the amount of muscle mass they have, but they might have 400 or 500 grams worth of carbohydrate they could store in their muscles. All right, and more if they're on a higher carbohydrate diet. But even if you take 500 grams, think about that. There are 454 grams in a pound. All right, so if you have 500 grams, that's a little more than a pound. That's dry glycogen. When you store it in the body, you'll store about another 2.5 to 3 pounds with it.
Right.
Of water. So you can go from a glycogen depleted state to a fully loaded glycogen state, and your muscles might increase their weight by 3 or 4 pounds.
Wow.
All right, so
could this be a big reason why when people first start a diet after not dieting, they lose a lot more weight in that first few weeks?
That's why the low carb diets have been wildly popular over the years, is because if you restrict carbohydrates, your liver glycogen and muscle the glycogen levels will become depleted, and particularly if you're exercising. And with it goes the water. So when people start a low-carb diet and they remove, most of the typical American diet's about 50% carb. So if you cut out virtually half the calories you're consuming, not only will you lose those carbs, you'll lose the water that goes with it. So people can drop 3, 4, 5 pounds like that.
Yeah,
They get really excited, and then the motivation kind of wanes with time because it's like, okay, this rate is not increasing.
They were doing the math and going, at this rate,
it's
6
like,
months from now.
it's like, what's happened? I reach a plateau here. And there have been plenty of studies to show that people, when they start out on these diets and they're monitored, their compliance just basically goes to virtually zilch after a month or two. And they just go off the diet.
And that can be managed better with just great expectations. So people that are watching or listening in, if you're somebody that's coaching a member or a client of yours, letting them know, like, hey, look, you haven't dieted or eaten better really in a couple of years. just this change alone, what we're going to notice over the next 2 to 3 weeks, we're going to notice a significantly bigger bump than we will in the weeks following.
Yeah.
And then my goal is for everything after this. So here's my baseline for the first 3 weeks, and then here's what we're going to be targeting for every week after. Would that be a better way to just set expectations so people now know when this happens, that's what meant to happen, not like, oh, it's not working anymore, something's wrong with me?
Yeah, it's much better to provide the individual with kind of a reasonable explanation for why things are occurring. But that becomes problematic, and this is something that has been the bane of the fitness weight loss industry since time started, all right, since dieting or exercise for weight control started. And that is the tremendous amount of biological variability we have in individuals. So, for example, if you take 100 women and put them on a diet, you're going to have 100 different responses, week by week, month by month.
Even if you do the exact same thing.
Even the exact same thing. I mean,
fitness, diet,
absolutely.
Everything.
There was a study published by some colleagues I know at the NIH in downtown Phoenix a few years ago, and they took 12 people, small sample, but you'll realize why it had to be small, because they had them give up several months of their life. They had to, not really give up, but they had to live in a facility, an inpatient facility at their NIH facility for about 9 weeks. 6 weeks on a diet, and then a few weeks either side of that for some tests and measurements. During the 6 weeks on the diet, they got exactly the same thing. Every single participant got exactly a 50% reduction in the foods that they were normally consuming. All right? So you would expect if everyone had exactly the same caloric restriction, you would have exactly the same weight loss. But even after 6 weeks, the weight loss varied twofold amongst individuals. And that was observed even after 1 week. So what happened early on was evident by week 5 or 6.
Wow.
And then they found out that the individuals could be characterized by how much their metabolism slowed down when they were confronted with a 24-hour fast. And individuals that had a pronounced reduction in their basal metabolic rate in response to a fast, they were the ones that had trouble losing weight. And this is largely just a genetic phenomenon. It's why you have more muscle mass than I do. Now, you probably lift more weights more frequently than I do, but you might be on the in terms of the bell curve of distribution for muscle mass, you might be on the muscular side. You can basically differentiate people on amount of muscle mass they have, amount of fat mass they have, even if they're not exercising. There will be a bell-shaped distribution. And individuals will respond to training differently. So some individuals, there are actually genes that have been identified as responder or non-responder genes. So it might be possible in the future to predict who might be better at responding to some sort of diet or exercise program than others. We're not quite there yet, but there's absolutely no question that there is a biological variability, and it is largely due to genetics.
So genetics is clearly something that's going to play a role in your...
It will always play a role.
It'll always play a role. There's nothing you can do about it. How can one, regardless of where they're at in the curve, what are some ways somebody can improve their metabolism?
Okay, so when you say improve the metabolism...
Metabolic rate.
Yeah, that is challenging. And the reason for that is because, think about this. Go back thousands of years ago. It would not make sense to have a body that had evolved to the point where if they became more active, their metabolic rate would go up. And the reason for that is because pre-industrial civilization, pre-agriculture, when we were hunters and gatherers, we relied on our skills to get food. Either kill the game and cook it and eat it, or gather berries and other types of foods. If we couldn't do that successfully, we would perish, all right? So think about this. In order to hunt and gather, you have to be active, particularly on the hunting side. You have to be active. So calories are at a premium. So it really wouldn't make sense if you tried to think of the design of a system for survival. You wouldn't want a system that if you exercised, your metabolism would be boosted and start revving up.
For a person that's a hunter.
Yes, and so we are those. Those are our ancestors. So basically, we all evolved from that. So right now, we are living in an environment that is got food almost everywhere, availability of food. Yet we still have the hunter-gatherer bodies. That's still in our genetic code.
So a hunter-gatherer body, though. When I see in a picture of my mind a hunter-gatherer, it is a person that is an athletic.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So wouldn't his metabolism naturally be higher?
No, it's not.
Why is it lower? Because he's so active that he doesn't need a high metabolism?
No, it's because there is no evolutionary advantage for having a high metabolism for the purpose we think of having a high metabolic rate so we can burn off calories. That's kind of it. You exercise, it revs up your metabolism, you burn off calories. That's kind of how we view things. But that's not how the body works. As a matter of fact, almost all the studies that have been published in this field show that the effect of exercise training on metabolic rate, your basal metabolic rate, like you and I are at now, we're a little bit higher than that. We're not at total basal metabolic rate, but we're close. That doesn't change all that much with exercise.
Really?
Now, we have the one factor that varies the most, that basically is the strongest predictor of your metabolic rate, is your fat-free mass. So if you did a body composition test, you could basically divide your body into fat mass and fat-free mass. Now, fat-free mass is more metabolically active than the fat mass, but not by a whole lot. And it varies by tissue. So what happens is that if you have more fat-free mass, you're going to have a higher metabolic rate. But it's largely in proportion to that fat-free mass. So you might think that people who have a lot of muscle mass might have a high metabolic rate. Not necessarily.
Because you hear that, right?
Yeah.
Muscle increases metabolism. You hear that.
But the thing is that if you... Well, let me ask you this question. Here's a pop quiz for today. If you were able to remove 1 pound of fat from your body and replace it with 1 pound of muscle, in other words, you could magically do that, how many calories extra a day do you think your metabolism would go up? 1 pound of muscle, you're putting into your body, you're taking away a 1 pound of fat. So you kind of have that magical, hypothetical exchange.
So I took off a pound of fat. I replace it with a pound of muscle, anywhere. And the question is, how many calories more am I burning per day?
Yeah, about how many calories extra do you think you would burn on a daily basis? Sorry to put you on the spot, but
I feel like it wouldn't be much. Is it a lot?
It's about 5.
5 more calories a day?
About 5.
That's really not anything. There's no...
Well, it's not that it's zero. It's just that in the context of us, the average person might consume a few thousand, it depends on how active you are. Active individuals, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. Your ultra endurance athletes, 7, 8, 9, 10,000 calories a day.
So
but
5 is
5 calories is basically noise. All right. So the average, and even though some individuals can gain a lot of muscle mass when they lift weights, the average amount of lean body mass gain with the typical type of exercise training program, like a resistance training program, is typically no more than about 1, maybe 2 kilos. So we're talking about 2 to 4 pounds. That would cover almost everyone, or a large percentage of the population that might undergo an exercise training program, resistance training program. So let's say it goes up by a couple pounds of muscle. And assuming you lost a couple pounds of fat, which may or may not happen, it's still going to be only about 10 calories a day difference. Now, if you add that up, say, well, 10 calories a day times 365 days a year, that's 36,500 calories. That's about a pound. So that could be something that is significant over the course of years and years. But when you look at in the context of most people will consume about 750,000 calories a year, the 5 or 10 extra a day for a pound or 2 of muscle is probably not all of that.
So when you hear about, like, certain companies talking about the afterburn,
Yeah.
right? Where it's like, hey, by working out here,
Yeah.
you're going to continue burning additional calories for the next 24 to 72 hours
Yeah.
or whatever it is from
Yeah.
this one 45-minute workout.
Yeah.
How much validity is there to that? And then and is it significant enough, or does it just sound significant?
It's not much.
Okay.
There is what is referred to as an EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. I had studied that when I was at Berkeley. It was part of my doctoral dissertation. I published a big review article on this about 35 years ago. It exists. There's no question about it. And you should include the EPOC as part of the caloric cost of exercise. But for most individuals, it's over fairly quickly. For most workouts, that 45-minute cardio workout that you mentioned, we've measured this in the lab. That EPOC is gone within probably somewhere around 30 minutes to a couple hours at most.
Really?
That's it. We've measured workouts where we have people come back the next day, and there's no effect whatsoever.
In what circumstance could it be 24 hours? Or
Okay.
Because it's got to have some study must have happened, right?
Yeah, there's only a couple instances that I can tell you where a significant EPOC, that afterburn, has been noticed more than 24 hours later. And that is under conditions of extreme exercise, like running a marathon or doing a triathlon type competition, which is not normal. I mean, most people wouldn't go. I mean, yes, lots of people run marathons, but if you're talking about an afterburn that might be evident after a workout, how many people run 26 miles in a workout? Okay,
Right.
that would be not feasible. The only weight training workout that I've ever seen that has had an afterburn last at least 24 hours and up to 48 hours was a workout that was published, probably at least 20, 25 years ago. And it's not a bad study. It's a good study. But the problem is that you'll see shortly that it might not be feasible for most people. It was in men, and they had them do 100 minutes of exercise where they did, I think it was 10 exercise, 5 sets, where they did it on a 2-minute cycle. So every 2 minutes they had to do a set. And so if you're doing 10 reps or something like that, it might take you, 30 seconds or something like that to actually do the set, then had like 90 seconds off. And they repeated that, and they did that for 100 minutes. So that's an hour and 40 minutes. So they had, so if they did it for 100 minutes on a 2-minute cycle, they did 50 sets. I think it was 10 exercise, 5 sets each. Every set was to failure.
Oh, wow. That's
Everyone.
exhausting.
All right. So think about a workout. How likely would it be to expect someone to do a 100-minute workout where you're on a 2-minute cycle? Now, I've seen people in the gym for 100 minutes, so an hour and 40 minutes. I've seen them, but they're not on a 2-minute cycle.
They're not on a 2 minutes, and they're not failing every single set.
And so a lot of the weight workouts you typically see people doing, they're lifting, and they might have several minutes between their sets. So think of doing 100 sets to failure. And yes,
or 100 minutes to
or
failure.
100 minutes, 50 sets to failure. I mean, I don't know if anyone would do such a workout. And
Is that even good for the joints to fail that much often throughout the week?
They only did it once.
But the idea is to do this on a regular basis to get that math, right?
The thing is, no one does that. So it's kind of, the answer to your question is kind of like just hypothetical, because no one would do that kind of workout, because even serious lifters would not do something that crazy. They might go in and just have say, hey, let's see what we can do today.
Right.
Just
That's a lot of sets.
Yeah, we just have it's like the individuals that started the Ironman competition 40 years ago in Hawaii. They just kind of had a bet to see who I think it was a different expertises, swimming, cycling, and running. So they just made up this Ironman thing that happened to be 2.4 miles of swimming, 112-mile bike ride. You might say, why'd they choose 112? Well, they said, well, we're going to go here and then back. Well, that's 112 miles it turned out to be. And then they run a marathon. So, but who would do that kind of nonsense? Well, it caught on. It's wildly popular now. But most people would not come close to that. Even in the weight room, no one's going to.
I'm not going to lie to you. Part of me is going, my next workout, I want to do 50 sets, 2-minute intervals to failure just to see.
Yeah. I mean, people might try that.
I'm doing it. I'm going to complete it, but I want to see how hard it was to actually complete.
But that's just it. I don't know. I can't think that it would be good for the body to continue to do that kind of thing.
Joints-wise,
and
ligaments.
just the stress on the muscle would be extraordinary to, the strain to do that. I mean, there was a study published about 40 years ago where a researcher at the University of Chicago, Illinois, published a paper where he had individuals do different types of aerobic and strength training workouts. One of the strength training workouts was over 10 weeks, where they worked out 5 days a week, and they worked out they didn't say to failure, they said as much load as could be lifted.
Right.
But they did this 5 days a week, and it was all lower body. They wanted to see if that could affect their running performance or cycling performance. So it was all leg work, like leg press and things like that, calf raises and so forth, but knee extensions. It was all lower body work, and they worked out 5 days a week. So that's 50 exhaustive workouts over the course of 10 weeks. Well, what happened and they measured their strength output, their performance once a week on various, like a leg press, for example. And sure enough, within the first 4 or 5 weeks, every week it went up, as you might expect. After 5 weeks, it just basically tapered off, and they couldn't improve and I think they were just wiped out.
I've got a buddy of mine who I met. He's very into fitness.
Yeah.
And he said something that he's been doing for a couple of years. He's very fit looking, but keep in mind, I understand genetics are a big part of everything. He basically does a full body workout, 3 days on, 1 day off, 3 days on. That's basically his routine. He's been doing that for a couple of years. It's a full body workout. He says, I don't go to failure. I could usually do about 5 more reps if I wanted to.
Yeah.
But I right around there. Like I know I could do 5 more, but I stop right there. And I'll work out for about an hour and a half to 2 hours, and I'll do that every day, 3 days a week, full body. He says he believes it to be really good, but of course I'm thinking like, well, everybody's a little different. That sounds like a lot of work, full body, 6 days a week essentially.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean,
does that sound like a lot?
It does sound like a lot.
Yeah.
But I will tell you that as far as the failure goes, there have been some studies published on this to show that strength gains are pretty similar across workouts that do or do not go to failure.
Really? See,
Yes.
I've always been taught that the muscle learns to grow because it's not good enough to do the task.
Yeah, no, it's that's pretty much a myth. The studies that have compared going to failure, where they literally go to the point where they can't do another rep, or they'll go and, like you said, they might be able, these are lifters who kind of have a sense of like what they can lift. So, and then of course after a number of workouts, almost every lifter will know about how many, you say, how many times could you bench press, 175 or something like that. And they'll have a good idea just from their trial and error and their experience. So the individuals that go to near failure, like they probably could do another rep or two, but they don't. The strength gains are about the same.
Wow.
So the moral of that story is, hey, you don't need to go to failure.
Protect the joints.
Yes, you don't need to do that to get strength gains.
Wow.
So, and the same is true for aerobic activity as well. You don't need to go till you just drop. You don't need to go to exhaustion to basically elicit a good cardiovascular or muscular benefit.
So I'm going to give you 2 questions that everyone in the world wants to know the answer to.
Yeah.
I bet you I can't imagine anybody would want. McKenna wants to know the answers to these 2 questions. Everyone does. And it's super broad. You're going to forget. You got to forgive me here. What if I said, Glenn, I want to grow muscle as fast as I can over the next 6 months. What are like 3 to 5 things that you want me to focus on doing, whether it's the style of workout, when I'm in the workout, frequency, nutrition, whatever it is? What are like 3 to 5 things you're like, Mike, if you just get these things right, all the other stuff's a lot of myths. First one's strength. How do I increase muscle? The next one is reduce body fat. So we'll do body fat second. So what would you tell me? 3 to 5 things, focus on these things.
Yeah, for the strength aspect, building muscle mass, improving strength, probably the most important thing is trying to get in at least 2 to 3 workouts a week that are high quality, where the number of sets and repetitions probably would give you per body part that you're working somewhere in the neighborhood of about 20 to 30 repetitions total that could be split into, whether it's 3 or 4 sets or 5 or 6 sets. So the optimum amount of gains seems to be individuals that have a workout in which the sets, the resistance is such that the number of repetitions that can be performed are anywhere from around 5 or 6 reps for on the low end, which would be a lot of load but low reps, and up to maybe about 12 to 15.
Is there any difference in benefit? You hear high reps, low weight, low reps.
There
or is
are
it volume.
Yes, there are. In terms of gains in lean mass, the variable that seems to predict the most, I mean, to be the most strongly correlated, is the total number of sets performed during a workout.
Really?
But that's very loose because you also have other variables in terms of how that is constructed and the intensity factor in terms of the actual load. So volume matters. Volume probably matters more for muscle mass development. The load lifted per contraction, basically the strain on the muscle per contraction, probably is more important for the strength aspects.
So if I did, let's say, 100 pounds of something 20 times, 200 pounds, 10 reps, should be generally around the same.
There is what is known as a strength training zone that is, and again, these are very loose definitions here, but it's based upon the repetition maximum concept. So generally, if you have a person do a 1 rep max, you train them through, and so you give them a lot of habituation so they feel comfortable with the load. You give them a 1 rep max, and then you want to have your workloads generally be in a situation where you're probably never lower than about 60% of a 1 rep max, but most of your work might be in the neighborhood of about 70 to 85 or 90% of your 1 rep max.
Okay.
And there are formulas you can because it's pretty well documented that if you know what a 1 rep max is, you probably can predict what the load is that you could lift 10 reps, a 10 rep max or a 15 rep max. It gets a little fuzzy when you get out into the 15, 20 rep max because then, it's kind of like you get into a flatter region of the curve. So just a little bit of change in the load, change in the number of reps, you can do a lot. But anywhere between the sweet spot is typically between about 65, 70 to about 85, 90% of a 1 rep max.
Okay.
And that'll give you your 5 or 6 to about 12 reps. But again, I have to mention that my experience is that it's the exercise question is almost like the same thing you would get on the diet side, which is the best diet for an individual, and that is problematic as well because what works for one may not work for another, and this has been studied where individuals have been placed on different kind of diets, even when they are categorized by their degree of metabolic defects and like insulin sensitivity and so forth. And the type of diet doesn't seem to be able to predict how much weight loss an individual might be able to lose. And the same thing with the strength, same thing even with endurance training. What works well for some individuals might not work well for others. Because I told you before, a while ago, if you take 100 people and put them on the same diet or same exercise program, whether it's strength training, aerobic training, a certain diet, you will have 100 different responses.
Yeah.
And that is largely due to the individual variability that we have. Some people are what we would call responders and others not. And that's true in virtually anything you do in life. We have responders and non-responders, and a lot of that is under genetic control. We'd like to think we have some control over that ourselves, but we're kind of limited there. So for example, like in sports, if you have the world's best marathoner, if you got their program, what they did every day they're in training, if you had randomly selected 100 people, had them do that workout, you're not going to get that, because that individual is largely there because of genetic.
I've got a question for you. This guy that I worked out with once, he's actually he was a strength coach professor as well. I can't remember what. I think it was just a community college up here, actually, at GCC. Really nice guy. Went to work out with him, and it was me and a couple other guys working out. And I've noticed this even still today. I work out with this guy, Lance, and we're about the same strength in some areas. Sometimes he's stronger than me, but I will be as strong as him in certain areas, maybe even stronger. But then we get to a point where when I die, I just die. I stop. I can't keep going. Whereas he'll keep plugging. This person, this coach, a strength coach, told me once a while back that there's people that have higher ratio of fast twitch muscles versus slow twitch muscles. He asked me if I was a fast runner and a high jumper, and I was very fast and was able to jump through the roof. But he says that could be really great where you're really strong and powerful out of the gate, but then you burn out real quick, whereas other people may be able to go on. Is there validity to that?
Yes, absolutely.
And so can that change you and what you should do? Like, should I, because I am more fast twitch and I will burn out quicker, should I aim for maybe lower reps because I know I'm going to get the most out of those first 5 to 7 reps than maybe another guy where he is more leaning on slow twitch where he can go 15, 20 reps before he really starts burning?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the way I mean it, but like when we both start feeling that burn, I've got maybe 2 to 3 left in me and he's got 10 to 15 left in him.
Yeah. I don't know that there's really been much done on that with regard to if you know a person's muscle fiber makeup, would that make a difference in terms of like the strength training? All muscle fibers can hypertrophy. Fast twitch muscles seem to be able to hypertrophy a little bit more than the slow twitch types of fibers. So that may have something to do with it over which we have no control because the
genetics.
Fiber makeup is largely just genetic.
Yeah.
And there are qualities of muscle that can be changed, but the inherent contractile properties of a muscle that determine fast, slow, those are primarily under genetic control. So there's not a whole lot you can do about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with the strength training stuff, sounds like doesn't need a failure every time, which that's actually very good to hear because as I'm getting older, I'm doing everything I can to protect my joints, protect all the stuff around the muscle and the bones. So that's great to hear. As far as nutrition goes, I'm wanting to, let's say, increase that lean muscle mass. How much truth is there to the amount of protein people are talking about that one needs to get? Some people are saying like 1 pound or 1 gram per kilogram of muscle or of weight. So if you weigh, let's say, 100 kilograms as an example, you should get 100 grams of protein.
Okay, so in terms of protein and what the body needs, the recommended daily amount is roughly 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day. That's the RDA. That's kind of like the recommended amount. So it's been recommended that endurance athletes who do a lot of aerobic type activity might be better off if that was a little higher, maybe up to about 1.1 to 1.3, somewhere in there. For strength athletes, might be up to closer to about 1.6 grams per kg body weight per day. Okay. So now that is from the protein that we consume in our meals, all right? So, we get protein from a lot of different sources. You can get it from animal products. You can get it from non-animal products.
Any research you've done on that as to which protein is better?
No, but
so pea protein or steak protein.
Actually, there are not in terms of whole foods per se, but in terms of dietary supplements, protein supplements. There's been a lot of research on that. So, for example, if individuals are within those ranges I just mentioned, so, and the reason why it's thought that the endurance athletes might need a little bit more is that occasionally there might be some excess protein turnover with all the high intensity training. And there were studies done long ago, some 30, 40 years ago, that suggested that when you get to a level of about 1.2 grams per kg body weight per day, it's probably going to cover everyone, because there is an individual variability. Some individuals can get by on less protein than others, but you never know until you actually would measure it yourself, and that would be virtually impossible. The only way to know if you're really getting adequate protein is to do nitrogen balance studies, in which you have to know how much protein is coming in. That's not hard to do. You just keep track of what your diet is, and particularly the protein sources. But the protein that's going out, you have to collect nitrogen, and that comes from the urine. So you basically have to have individuals collect their urine in a jug over a period of a day and then analyze it for nitrogen. So you know how much nitrogen came in the diet and how much nitrogen went out. You find out if
and that's different day to day probably, right?
It can be, you're right. So you typically need it over a few days that people do this.
What do you do with this jar of urine once you get it? Where do you send this thing?
You just basically do a nitrogen analysis, urea.
Oh, they send you like a kit and you dip
or
something?
Yeah, but no individuals will be able to do this. I mean, this is not something, this is something
You give me a lot of ideas. I'm ready to buy kits. I'm ready to buy a jar.
Yeah, I don't know that one's available, but I do know that researchers do this to look at what is called nitrogen balance. And so those were those data come from. But there have been a number of studies, particularly for resistance exercise individuals, to look at different types of protein, whether individuals need extra supplements, and to see whether that works. And these studies show that as long as individuals are getting a baseline protein intake of at least about 1.2 to 1.5 or somewhere in that range, grams per kg body weight per day, the extra protein coming in as a supplement, and it could come in, there are lots of different supplements out there. For a while, whey protein was thought to be wildly popular because it was had the highest concentrations of the branched chain amino acids, leucine,
you hear a lot about that.
Isoleucine and valine, particularly leucine. But studies that have looked at whey protein or protein blends, a blend of whey, casein, soy, and so forth, those studies show that it really doesn't matter. As a matter of fact, the placebo that gets a maltodextrin, which is just a carbohydrate, their improvements in strength and lean body mass are almost the same as those that get the
so whether you get a whey protein or a pea protein,
it's basically...
What about collagen protein or...
All those have been studied, and it's basically those show that there's not much difference between the individuals that get just a placebo, which is a non-protein supplement, and those that get the protein supplements. But the point is that if you look at these studies, there's huge variability. You get some individuals that take the whey protein or the protein blend that get huge increases way up here, like 5-6 kilos of lean body mass gain. So they're getting like 10-12 pounds of lean body mass gain, which is just over a period. These studies usually last about 3 months or so. That's pretty
quick.
That's a big increase. But then you get individuals that are way down, almost nothing. And then even with the individuals that get the placebo, no protein supplement, you get them up here too. So
it's hard to tell because how much of it's genetics.
Yeah. So in other words, you have the distribution from low responders to high responders between the placebo and the different protein supplement combinations. They overlap a lot, which means you get individuals that probably would respond well to the resistance training regardless of what you gave them. You can give them dog food, and they could probably improve a lot. I mean, these are your natural responders that you get, you wait, and I'm sure in your experience, you have seen individuals who you train and within weeks or months, it's like they've transformed their body. And then others that basically struggle day in, day out.
They work just as hard or harder.
Yeah, and they don't improve, and that's largely due to genetics.
Have there been studies on the same individuals to see if, let's say, someone like me, I might respond better with a whey protein versus a pea protein or a collagen protein?
That's a great question, and those have not really been done. So in my classes, when I show the research, and the fundamental question is at the end is, what the researchers could have done is basically at the end of their study, they could have switched, kept them training, and the ones that got the whey protein, give them some other, give them the placebo, whatever, and or redo the study, have them detrain, come back in 6 months after they've kind of washed out and they've lost their strength gains, and do it again, but switch the groups around. Any which way you want. In other words, to answer that question, would individuals be better off with one particular type of supplement? And we don't know the answer to that.
Yeah.
But my guess is that it probably wouldn't make that much of a difference. I really think that the biggest factor in improving strength, muscle mass, power, whatever, is largely due to the inherent qualities of the individual. And
the genes,
the genes and the genetic potential they have for improvement. Yeah.
What about the things that may be negatives to it? Like you hear people, so let's say all proteins equal in this example. Some people are like, yeah, but the other factors that come with a pea protein are better than with a whey. You got the dairy, and dairy isn't good for you. And certain, what are your thoughts on that? Like, what are there negatives to whey protein?
No, I don't think so. Not unless someone has an allergic reaction to it. But
what's your thoughts on dairy?
I consume it. I mean, there's no question that some people might have issues with it. Some people that are lactose intolerant.
Because there's some people that are like, dairy is not meant for humans, meant for baby cows.
Yeah, but if you look at this, I know there have been lots of diets out there, the paleo and so forth. But if you look at the people who study this and study the anthropology of this, and you try to assess what the diets of hunter-gatherers might have been like eons ago, before industrial revolution, before agriculture, and back in the hunter-gatherer days, these societies, you find that they ate pretty much anything they could get their hands on. And if you take a look at modern day, if you call them modern day, but current day hunter-gatherer societies that range from geographical locations near the equator, all the way up into the Arctic. So we go from very equatorial type regions to more temperate and then Arctic regions. Their diets change dramatically. They're different. They don't change, but they're just different because the availability of food in one place is not the same as others. And yet these individuals, these hunter-gatherer societies, they don't have the kinds of chronic diseases that plague people who live in modern industrialized societies, in which they don't get a lot of activity and their diets aren't exactly the healthiest. So the notion that our bodies weren't designed to consume dairy, I think that's kind of nonsensical. The body can be, some people will have issues with it.
Sensitivities, but people have sensitivities to strawberries.
Yeah, but the human, life form here, I think the body can probably consume pretty much anything.
Yeah.
And so I think that is not nearly as important as basically how we interact with our environment. So most people, that I don't deal with hunter-gatherers or subsistence level farmers, but when individuals ask me, what's the best diet? I'd like to go on a diet. What kind of diet you can recommend? Well, years ago, I used to immediately get into a discussion of the options, the low carb or low fat or, whatever, these kinds of diets. But now the question I ask is, the first question is, how much do you exercise? Because that's critical. It's now been pretty well documented that the individuals that consume the most food have the best weight control. And that is because the key feature of optimum weight control is what is referred to as a metabolic flux. That's the turnover, the constant intake and burning of calories. And our bodies seem to regulate weight better when we're exercising more. And when we exercise more, we eat more. And when we eat more, we have that cycle, that metabolic flux is what it's referred to, seems to allow us to control our body weights more or better. If we fall to a very low level of activity, very sedentary lifestyle, that becomes dysregulated. And that is the main problem I think we have in the United States and other Western cultures, that we have this disconnect. Where most of us are in a daily physical activity energy expenditure range that is not optimal for weight control. In other words, controlling intake and commensurate with the energy expenditure. These studies have been shown in animals as well. You take animals that normally exercise a lot, rodents, heck, anyone who's had a pet hamster or a rat in their life, put a wheel in there, and these things just turn practically all night long. And researchers have studied that. Some of these little buggers, these little rats, will put in a 10K a night.
Wow.
Now think about that. The average rat running at 70% of VO2 max, I know because I've had rats, I've studied this. When I was at Berkeley, we actually measured oxygen uptake and energy expenditure on rats while they were exercising. At 70% of VO2 max, which is kind of like a nice, comfortable pace, that's about 1 mile an hour. So some of these rats will get in about 6 hours of running a night. And that's what they naturally do. But if you don't let them do that, they will get fat. And they get fat because they don't downregulate the amount of food they take in. But if you let them exercise more, they will take in food and they kind of match the intake and expenditure. Humans do the same thing. There have been very elegantly designed studies where individuals have been studying these whole room calorimeters. Think of a room about this size where you live in for a week, and it's got a bed, a desk, a toilet. You just live in it. It's like living in a little dorm room that's completely self-contained. And they can measure the energy expenditure over a 24-hour period. These individuals, when they're studied under these conditions, the more they exercise, the better their weight control. And they're allowed all the food they want. The researchers just give them all the food. Say, you want more food? Here. They give them trays in the morning, trays in the midday, trays in the evening of food. And they say, eat only what you want. If you don't want it, take it back. We don't care. We're not worried about the waste, so don't feel compelled to eat it. But they'll always eat more when relative to their energy expenditure when they're not doing that much.
Wow.
And that is basically, I think, kind of a microcosm of what's going on in our modern day world, that we don't exercise enough to regulate body weight. So we shouldn't think about, and this is, I think, where we've got things wrong. Most people historically, to try for weight control in our country, have tried to cut back on calories rather than exercise more. I mean, that's just a fact that when you ask people, what's the number one reason or number one method you use for weight control, always number one is cutting calories.
Well, yeah, but here's the thing. I think you're right. But I mean, some people in this country are living off of, like, every day they'll get a Big Mac or they'll get something like that, where it's hard to not get 5,000 calories a day in when your breakfast consisted of 2 sausage and egg cheese, biscuits, and then for lunch you had fries and a burger, and then for dinner you had maybe some pizza or you had leftover or whatever, and then you snack throughout the day on chips, or you have 2 cans of soda. I mean, if you do that, there has to be a limited calories at some level, because it's easy to get in 1,000 calories with a certain type of diet.
Oh, there's no question. Like I mentioned, food availability is just, it's obvious, it's everywhere. No one really would dispute that. I mean, there are some places where there's a lot of issues, poverty and so forth. There's no question that not everyone has access to adequate food. All right, but for the most part in our country, I think collectively, you could make that statement. And certainly we have lots of big options available. But studies also show that the increase in portion sizes, I mean, if you mentioned the Big Macs and so forth, if you look at the fast food industry, the amount of food available through fast food and the increased sizes of the portions of burgers, of chicken sandwiches, fries, sodas, all that stuff, they have increased dramatically. And you say, well, that explains it all. But actually it doesn't. The research suggests that even individuals, because you mentioned, okay, these individuals, they might eat a Big Mac, they might have a big breakfast or something like that. But the studies that have tracked these individuals suggest that that's probably not the main problem. that just the increase in portion size. Yeah, it makes sense, but it's probably more due to the fact if there's one dietary variable that I think might be more able to explain this, it's the frequency of eating. Yeah, the frequency of eating.
So do you like intermittent fasting?
No.
You don't like it?
I don't fast. I like to eat, so I don't do it. I feel very uncomfortable when I'm not, eating.
So is there a benefit, or is there any studies on
there
that?
have been lots of studies on this, and the majority of the studies seem to suggest that it's the calorie restriction over time, whether you do it through intermittent fasting. So and intermittent fasting can last you can do it a day, you can do it 2 days, you can have that 5+2 plan or whatever, where you fast a couple days a week or something like that. There are all sorts of ways you can configure
or
this.
16-hour fast per day.
Whatever, yeah. And most of those studies seem to suggest when you really get down to it, any weight loss is due to the calorie restriction and not necessarily due to the nature of the intermittent fast itself.
Okay.
Yeah, there have been all sorts of studies that have looked at this. And I would say the number one thing is probably just the calorie restriction, which means that some people, I get back to this, you always, if you watch TV and you see an ad for something about a product or a drug or something like that, you always at the end see the fine print that says individual results may vary. That's because they always vary.
Yeah.
And that is true with virtually anything. So talking about diet or exercise or what's the best way is almost like talking about religion. And I've learned that that can be a
messy thing.
A messy thing.
Right.
So because diet, a lot of people have their own preconceived notions about what is good or bad.
So
and
now
what
they're
works
just
for
looking
them.
for information that supports their...
Yeah, and so, we have this confirmation bias that we naturally try to seek out things that confirm our own biases. So, I'm an educator, and when I teach classes, I just throw everything out there.
Yeah,
we discuss everything.
I'm an experimenter, so I go, when I want to research something, I don't go in there, like even in this conversation here, I'm open to everything you said. There's things that you've said, you said things that are against what I've learned, but I mean, you researched it more than other people I've learned it from. So I'm also open to that idea and seeing what else is there out there on these topics. Yeah. So here's something that's almost as big as religion. I'm interested in your thoughts on it. Veganism.
Mm-hmm. Again, it's going to be fine for some and not so fine for others.
Because I struggled with it.
Yeah, there's a personal choice. I've never been into veganism. I'm an omnivore. There's just no question about that. And I kind of follow the science. Now, if you take a look at all the science on diets and health, I think you will find more support for the research that suggests that the closer we move, so you can have veganism, and then on the other extreme, you can have basically just absolute carnivores.
Yeah.
All right, so you can have a mix in the middle. If you take a look at ask the question, okay, God, there are a lot of options out there. I mean, you go into a grocery store and there's like thousands, tens of thousands of items you can choose from. And even if you just go to the outside of the sections, the produce and things like that, the fresher items and not the packaged stuff in the middle. Even those you have thousands of items to choose from. So how to put a diet together that is healthy. If there's one thing that I think percolates up and basically is solid support for, the closer individuals get to the vegan side, in other words, more of a plant-based diet, the healthier they will be.
So it's plant-based.
Yeah, plant-based.
It's like when you see a movie and it's based on a true story.
Yeah.
It's not a true story. It's just based on a true story, but there's some fiction here and there's some meat here as well.
But the plant-based in this instance means diets that are largely non-meat. In other words, they have more fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes like peas and pulses, things like that. Those kinds of foods. They generally, these when you study them by themselves or collectively, these always seem to be associated with better health outcomes. So
Yeah.
there's, again, a lot of noise in the nutrition literature. It's because it's difficult to study. From an epidemiological standpoint, large populations, you have people fill out diet records and food frequency questionnaires, and they're notoriously inaccurate for really assessing what people eat. But even in individual meal settings, all sorts of foods have different properties that affect us acutely. And again, most of the studies would suggest that the more plant-based the diet is, in other words, the more fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and those kinds of foods, natural foods you have, probably the better off you're going to be. Now, that doesn't mean you have to eliminate the stuff on the other side. And that might be a matter of just personal choice. But individuals who consume heavily on one side, like the meats, dairy would be included in that, particularly the whole dairy.
The carnivore diets.
Yeah, those, again, most of the studies would suggest, and there are very few people in the real world that eat like that, but the studies seem to suggest that those are probably not as healthy as other types of diets. So, I mean, most of the studies seem to suggest that diets that have a lot of processed meat, a lot of red meat, have associations with adverse health outcomes compared to those diets that have few of those products, but more of the plant-based foods.
Yeah.
But again, there are a lot of studies that suggest that you're somewhere in the middle might be the happy medium.
Yeah. That's amazing. Well, look, out of respect to your time, because we spent a lot of time in here. This is, honestly, I can go for, and McKenna's really into this stuff too. Could you go for another 2-3 hours easily?
Yeah, this is like
Yeah, so I would love to, if you're open to it, I would love to do another thing down the road.
Yeah, we can do it. Be
You're
fine.
just such an interesting guy.
Yeah.
You got so much great information. If there's one thing anybody listening and watching, if you guys, hopefully you took a lot of notes. If not, it's because you didn't anticipate this being something worthy of getting out your pen and pad for, because it was in sales and marketing like you guys normally like. Go back, watch it again, pen and pad, because what I gathered from this is there's a lot of opportunities of things that I think debunk a lot of myths in what a lot of the stuff that you said and what research shows that allow us to stand apart. So if I'm talking to you as a prospect, somebody that may want to work with me, it's great to sometimes go against the grain as opposed to with it, especially if against the grain is truth. Everybody's saying, oh, you got to do this type of workout or don't have this type of work. And once I can say, no, here's what the research shows, here's the studies, and you can actually pull these studies out, it gets a person to feel safe, because I think the being uncertain is the biggest reason people stop doing stuff. I don't know if I'm even doing the right thing. It's not working. Am I wasting my time?
Virtually everything will work to a certain extent. And that's the nice thing about exercise or even dietary choices, that particularly with the exercise, virtually anything will work. And the reason for that is because most people start from the standpoint of a sedentary lifestyle. So with that, virtually anything you do to eliminate or reduce the amount of time you spend sedentary is going to be beneficial. Take, for example, the HIIT workouts. I mentioned before that most of the traditional HIIT workouts have been where the intervals last anywhere from about 1 to 4 minutes or so. And then there's the sprint interval training that you get down a little bit lower, like 30 second sprints. But just this week, the experimental biology meeting was going virtual now. It just ends today. It was Tuesday through Friday of this week. There was an interesting study from the University of Texas that was presented where individuals went on a couple-month-long exercise training program that was HIIT. But the HIITs, guess how long the intervals were?
15 seconds?
4 seconds.
Wow.
4 seconds. They would do 4-second high-intensity sprints. It was on a bike. You have to do it on a bike because you can't really do it running, because if you did that on a treadmill or something, it would take that much time just to get it up to a sprint speed. So they did on a cycle, 4-second sprints all out. And then they had typically about 15 to 20 or 30 seconds of kind of rest in between, and then repeat that. The whole workout only lasted 10 minutes. And yet at the end of, I think it was either 8 or 12 weeks, they demonstrated improvements in performance and fitness. So, only 4 seconds for a sprint. I mean, you can't even get fatigued in 4
Can
seconds.
you even burn like at that point, aren't you just burning ATP?
Well, yeah, that's largely going to be an ATP-driven, creatine phosphate-driven. It's probably phosphocreatine. Creatine phosphate in 4 seconds will probably drop to about 50%, 40% of what its initial value. But that's just primarily initial energy stores, the phosphagens, that'll be driving that. But overall, I mean, ultimately it will burn fuel because those phosphagens have to be replaced.
And the heart rates,
Well, those phosphagens have to be replaced. But again, the point is that this was not about calorie burning. It was about trying to overcome one of the most widely cited reasons for people not exercising. And most people say, I just don't have the time.
Yeah, now you got 10 minutes.
So you can have 10 minutes and 4 second sprints. I mean, how exhausting can that be? And then you get 15 to 30 seconds rest afterwards. So it's not like this is something where you're just busting a gut out there.
Yeah.
And they demonstrated improvements in fitness. And the purpose of this, the importance is that fitness itself is a very important predictor of mortality. So if you want to reduce your risk of dropping dead of a heart attack, you can do a number of things. If you're a smoker, you could quit smoking. If you have high blood pressure, you could go on a medication to lower your blood pressure. High cholesterol, you could go on a statin drug or something like that. If you're unfit, you could become fit. Of those risk factors I just mentioned, for example, the high risk factors for like heart disease, I just mentioned smoking, high blood pressure, cholesterol, and so forth. Fitness level is just as important, if not more important, than any of those. So a high fitness level reduces your risk of mortality by as much as any of those other classic cardiovascular risk factors I mentioned. Normally we wouldn't think of it in that way, but being a fit person reduces your chances of dropping dead of a heart attack as much as anything that has been shown in terms of classic risk markers for cardiovascular disease.
That is awesome. So fitness is the key, guys. You're in the right industry. Glenn, thank you so much for taking the time.
Sure.
I really appreciate it. For everyone watching, for everyone listening, thank you so much. And we'll see you next week.